what did that look like for you in the White House without disclosing anything that's classified or whatever? But it's a world. Fortunately, unfortunately, it's just the reality where pale and male dominates still. And we're hopefully, as a dad of three daughters, hopefully we can get to the point where when I introduce you, Theresa, you are a former White House chief information officer, and the female part has less of a play in it. Share a little bit about that if you could.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I was the first female to hold that role of chief information officer at the White House, and what a great honor. I really didn't think about it that way at the
Yeah.
time, and nobody said, during the interview process, if you take this job, you're going to be the first ever female to ever hold it. It was sort of something that just sort of was like, oh, everybody had this aha moment later. But what I will say is, President George W. Bush, one of the things that he had said prior to my arrival there, so this is second half of his second term, is when I worked for him. And he said, we're always focused on leaving the White House, this place, better than we found it for generations to come, not just the next person who wins and comes into this office, but for generations to come. And one of the things that he said is, I would really like to see new names, people who have never been political appointees before. Let's be very deliberate and focused on bringing in more candidates that are minorities, women, people who haven't held these roles before. And because he made it a point, just saying, like, I want the best, most qualified person, but I need you to cast a wider net, which includes people who maybe were never political appointees before. He was able to, really bring in new people like me who had never been a political appointee. And I even remember in the interview process. So, okay, well, let's just take a moment just on the interview process.
Right.
Amazing. So, and it was a nice mix of male and female throughout the whole interview process. I mean, President George W. Bush had a lot of females on his executive staff team. But it was funny because I'm sitting in it's an interview process like no other. I did not have a clearance. I was in financial services industry, had seen a lot of things, but did not have a clearance. And almost every question you would normally ask during an interview process as a candidate, I didn't have a clearance to know the answer. We kind of get it to this point in the interview, and they're like, "Well, do you have any other questions?" And I said, "Do you have any you can answer?" And they said, "Probably not." We, kind of had a good laugh. And I said, "Well, I guess my last question would be, because I don't really know a whole lot about the job, is how do you know I'm qualified? I don't feel like I have enough information to really know that I'm qualified, and I wouldn't want to let anybody down if I were selected for the job." And what was great is, because John turned to me and he said, "It's funny you asked that question." And he said, "But here are your transferable skills. Yes, you've never been a political appointee before, never worked in politics before, but you work in a 24/7 environment. If banking systems goes down, everybody knows it. You're used to executives who are, mobile and global. You're used to being in a heavily regulated under the spotlight environment. A lot of those things are very transferable to working in the White House. And what you don't know, we'll teach you."
Right.
Okay. But it was just a really interesting interview process. And what I would say is just a very welcoming executive team, both male and female. And I had a lot of people really looking out for me, especially knowing I'd never been a political appointee before. So they'd pull me aside and say, here's some important things you didn't need to know. Like, here's an example. I had more than one person pull me aside and say, "You'll notice, President George W. Bush, he's not going to write a lot of notes down and things like that. And he runs everything like a really tight ship, clockwise, business wise. But if he asks you a question, he has a mind like a steel trap on dates and numbers and things like that. So do not give him a date or a number unless you expect to be held accountable to it." And I remember being asked about what was possible and could it be possible. And I remember looking to my left and right at sort of the senior staff in the room. And I said, "If you don't mind, I'd like to really just study things first before I commit to a date." And I'll give the answer to deputy chief of staff, and he goes, somebody coached her. But it was great that somebody did that for me, because normally in the corporate America I would have said something like, well, we're heading towards this kind of a date, but I need
Right.
to think through this, and I'll get back to you through the program office and all those kinds of things. They're like, do not commit, because it'll get locked up here, and the next time he sees you he's going to ask. So it was just things like that were really, really great.
That was great, great guidance and great teamwork